Hi everyone, welcome to Woolen Spinning. My name is Rachel. This is a bonus Spinning Pearls vlog. So for those who are not aware of this corner of the internets, I want to welcome you to this place. You are welcome here. We come together to share our passion for handspun yarn, for making yarn, for creating fabric that we make from our handspun yarn. It's all about hand spinning. There's a theme here. So this Spinning Pearls is they're like vlogs and teaching content, extra little bits and pieces that happen behind the scenes. The live stream and the podcast itself, Woolen Spinning, happens throughout the month and it's sort of released publicly. It's for everyone. And then Spinning Pearls are these vlogs, these short spurts of information about various things that I share with you guys. Some of them are requests, some of them are premeditated, where I map out all of the content that's going to be released throughout the year. Some of them are updates. Sometimes it's just hey, this is the year that we had and look at what we've done. So that's what Spinning Pearls is. Recently, I was asked to create a Longwools revolution, to go through Longwools with you guys and give you some tips and tricks around spinning. So today we're going to get on the wheel. We're going to talk about prepping the fiber, especially when it's a carded preparation. We're not talking about spinning true worsted here. We're going to be talking about how to deal with those bats that are so often a part of a lot of the prep that's available out there online right now. It might be a Romney bat, it might be Cotswold, it might be any number of other long wools. And we don't want these wools to hurt your feelings. We don't want you to walk away from the spinning experience feeling completely crushed. So let's go through some tips and tricks as to how to get started with these wools. They are a longer staple, they are coarser, they are less crimp, and so we need to think about slowing down our feet, changing our whirl sometimes, making our wheel go a little bit slower, keeping our hands super, super light to touch when we're holding that fiber, and also being really super kind to ourselves. Afterwards, I'll go through a couple of my projects with you, long wool projects that worked really well as one that wasn't ideal. It didn't work out really super well. So I hope you enjoy this snippet of how spinning with the long wools can go. Tips and tricks at the wheel, thinking about some of the things that you want to think about when you're approaching these spins. One of the things I will say before we get started is there are a lot of long wools out there on the market. Try as many as you possibly can, and remember and recognize that they are all out there for a reason. We have access to all of these different wools for a reason. They all do what they do very well. And sometimes when we apply them to other uses, it maybe doesn't go quite as well, or it's a little bit too toothy, or it's got a little bit too much of a halo, or it's a little bit too dense and making the sweater a little bit heavy. That's okay. It's all part of the learning opportunities and the learning that comes from working with these wools more and more and getting more and more comfortable. Many of us do card these wools. They are not so long stapled that they can't not go on the Swift of your drum carder. That's the big drum of your drum carder. They are not so long that they can't not do that. So try, sample, see what you can come up with, because spinning these wools is like nothing else. All right, let's get to the wheel. So this bat is quite long. And what I'm going to do is just open it up a little bit so that I can divide it into half to spin half of the fiber to one bobbin and half of the fiber to another bobbin to create a 2-ply. I'm just going to very gently pull it apart. I don't want to rip the bat so that the fibers just get completely pulled out of alignment and pulled out of the preparation that they're in. I want to just ease them apart, just very gently. I know that it's carded prep and generally the fibers are not parallel, but I can ease these into a slightly more worsted preparation if I just ease the fibers apart and I don't completely destroy the prep by just ripping at the bat. So just be very gentle when you're pulling stuff apart. We want to ease things apart versus just ripping the bats and just sort of pulling our hands apart like this and just pulling. use your hands to support the fibers as you separate them. So what I'm actually going to do here is I've kind of added a little bit of twist as I've rolled up each half of the bat into my hands to make these big nests of fiber. And I've just added a little bit of twist just to hold the fibers together and keep them aligned, relatively organized. But if this sort of undoes itself, it's not going to just fall apart. That slight bit of twist is just going to help to keep it a little bit more organized until I'm actually ready to spin that half. Now I'm going to take a moment and I'm going to weigh these two nests of fiber and just make sure that they're roughly the same weight so that I have two relatively similar weight bobbins when I'm finished. So they're relatively similar. One of them weighed in at 26.5 and the other one weighed in at 28.5. So I'm just going to see if I can take a little bit off of the one and add it to the one that was ever so slightly lighter. So now that's weighing in at 27 grams. And this should be weighing in at 27 point something. Yeah, it's 28, close enough. So what I'm going to do with this is I'm actually going to, I just unraveled it because I've weighed them. I know sort of where I'm at in terms of the weight. And now it's time to start spinning. So some people will sit down and just start spinning from this, and they have the skill and the ability to be able to manage this at the wheel and manage this big preparation of fiber, and more power to you. If you prefer just sitting down and spinning, go for it. I'm going to show you what I tend to do, and I'll tell you why. So first, I'm going to do exactly what I did when I was dividing these in half. I'm just going to very gently pull this apart. And again, I'm using my fingers to support the fibers as I work my way down the bat. I'm not just going to rip it apart. I'm going to just very gently support them as I go. And normally I would prep this all at once, but I am actually going to put this aside for now because I'm going to work through my entire process and show you what I do. So normally I would do all of this again and again until the full half was prepared. But I'm going to take this strip that I pulled off the bat and I'm actually going to divide it again. And when I'm spinning long wools or fine to medium wools, I do this where I do strip these bats down if I'm not thinking about color management. I just, it's all one color, or I'm not worried about color management. I do this just mostly for ease of spinning. I really like having a really nicely prepared strip of fiber. And I do pre-draft quite aggressively. Sometimes I'll go through and do this pre-drafting process twice. Now from this end where I finished off, as I'm wrapping, I'm going to add a little half twist every time I turn my hand. Again, just to keep the fibers organized. Keep this bat, this little mini nest from becoming disorganized or becoming tangled. And so that's what I'm going to spin from. I'm going to do this other one as well so that I have some fibers quite a bit of fiber to show you as I'm spinning. I have another one prepped for you and ready to go. So again, I'm just moving down the fibers. I've got sort of my hands are a good 20 centimeters apart or 8 inches apart. And I'm just drafting very gently. I don't want to break the staple and actually pull the fiber apart. So I'm very careful as to how far I'm pulling. Probably about 2 inches-ish. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to add that half turn, that half twist all the way along that fiber to keep it organized. Now what I've effectively created here is what we would call a smooth bat. So if you look at those fibers, the reason why I wore my spinning apron today is because you can see those fibers through the apron because these are so dark. This Romney is quite dark, and the llama that Melissa added is dark. So you can really see these fibers, even though they've been carded, with the pre-drafting and being very gentle with the bat as I've stripped it down, I've been able to actually basically realign the fibers and keep them almost more what I would call a semi-worsted preparation. So lots and lots of air. It's very, very light, very poofy, very floofy. We have no idea where the tips and butts are. So nothing is aligned in terms of tips going one way and butts going the other way. I don't care. That doesn't matter to me. I just want that air and that loft and a smooth, relatively parallel preparation where these fibers are relatively parallel and are going to slide across each other in a relatively sort of worsted, a more worsted-like fashion. Now, the second thing that I do when I am spinning these long wools is I slow my wheel down. So my wheel is generally set up for fine to medium wool spinning. I tend to keep my wheel running on a relatively high ratio. I'm not a very fast treadler. For those who've followed me for a long time, you guys know this. I tend to treadle quite slowly. I was taught to only treadle fast enough to keep that drive wheel running. For better or for worse, it's just a habit that I have formed. And as soon as I go into autopilot spinning, I default back to that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start my wheel running in the clockwise direction, or the Z twist direction, so to the right. I tend to like to have knitting yarns that have been plied in the counterclockwise or S twist direction, so to the left. So I tend to spin my singles in the clockwise direction or the Z twist direction. So I'm going to start that running. My wheel is currently running at about 20, 22 to 1-ish, and I'm just going to slow that down to more like 12 to 1, 14 to 1-ish. You don't need all of that twist going into those long wools. You've got longer staples and you've got less crimps per inch. And so you don't need a ton of twist running through these fibers as you spin. So I'm going to just start spinning and get into a bit of a rhythm here, and then we'll talk through what I'm doing and what I'm looking for. I don't want this rolling around all over my lap. So what I tend to do, you can work from a distaff if that's natural for you and that's enjoyable for you. What I tend to do is I unwrap a whole bunch of the fibers and I just leave them on my lap. And then I tuck the rest into this little pocket here that Katrina's mom, Katrina of Crafty Jack's boutique, designed. And so I just tuck it in there. It's hanging off to the side. It's out of my way. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to worry about it. And I can just keep working unencumbered. So notice with the long wools how far apart my hands are. We don't want our hands to be particularly close together like they are with the fine to medium wools. The reason for this, of course, is because the staple lengths are longer, the fibers are slightly denser, and we just need room to work. So move your hands apart. And that backhand that's holding onto the fiber, whether you're doing a short forward inchworm type draft where we're just drafting forward, or a continuous backward draft where we're draft, draft, and on, draft, draft, and on. Whichever you choose, or we can do short backward where we do a draft back, smooth, and on, draft back, smooth, and on. So any of these drafts, whatever you choose, be consistent. But that backhand, that fiber supply hand, the hand that's holding that fiber, is holding that fiber incredibly lightly. It's like it's holding a baby down feather, just something really, really fine. And that if we hold it tight, we're going to squoosh it or take the life out of it. Think about really light hands. We're barely holding the fiber at all. We're just holding it enough to give that forward hand something to draft against. And you've seen me go back a couple of times and do what's called double drafting. And this is where if there's a big clump of fiber that comes forward, let's say there's this big bunch of fiber, I don't like it, I can just stop, untwist, draft it apart a little bit, let the twist run up, start treadling, and then go on. So that's called double drafting, where we go back and we sort of fix those areas where the fibers maybe draft forward a little bit too much. There's maybe a little bit of a tangle and we want to take that out. So how do you know if you have enough twist going into your singles or not? With the Longwools, it's really common that if somebody is spinning along and they aren't sure that they're putting enough twist in, they'll start to treadle faster, or they'll increase their ratio so that more twist, so that the flyer is turning more times and adding more twist to the singles. And they will start to create sort of a harder, wiry yarn that's starting to air more into what we would call rope. So how do you know that you're not making rope? And the other extreme, of course, is, oh, I don't want to make rope, so I'm going to make sure that my yarn is only slightly twisted. And what ends up happening is there isn't enough twist to hold the fibers together and the yarn drifts apart. And so in the plying process, the singles will start to break, and it means that the fibers were not what we call twist locked. And twist lock is where there's enough twist that the fibers are twisted enough that when tugged on at either end, so from here to here, that the yarn doesn't pull apart. So if you want to check twist lock, you just give a tug on either end of your singles. And if it drifts apart, it's not twist locked. If it stays like this and you have a little bit of a tug test, there's a little bit of tension, a little bit of bounce and recoil, and you've got a little bit of twist in your singles, you know that it's twist locked, that there's enough twist in that singles to make viable yarn. So how do you know if you're not putting in enough twist, or if you're putting in too much twist and you're making, say, rope versus an under twisted yarn that's not going to make a viable fabric? So when you go to do, what I do is when I go to do my plyback test and I go to see what this looks like, I'm looking for a nicely twisted, airy, lofty yarn. So I'm not looking for a yarn that's too tightly twisted, that when it goes into the plyback test that it springs into place and it's really, really tight. I'm not looking for that. I'm also not looking for a yarn that looks underplied and looks really lofty and too airy and too ill-defined, where the singles in the actual yarn itself, you can't really tell what fibers belong to which singles. I'm looking for a yarn that looks like yarn, that's ever so slightly, just slightly, like just a titch underspun. So this would be an example of a yarn that is adequately spun. This is what I'm looking for, because when I finish plying, I am going to tighten it up slightly in the plying and make that twist angle slightly more aggressive. Not too much, but slightly, probably the equivalent of a half turn. A yarn that is overspun when I do the plyback test would be an example that looks like this. So I'm adding more twist. My feet are moving more quickly. It's automatically spinning a finer yarn because I'm fighting against too much twist, and the yarn starts to just naturally draft slightly thinner. So as I add that extra twist, when I go to do the plyback test, the plyback test looks and feels slightly more wiry. It just looks a little bit more, wiry is the best word. It looks ever so slightly rope-like. So when I'm looking to spin that ideal long wool yarn that's going to make a really great sweater, to me, this yarn is overspun in the plyback. This is not what I'm looking for in the plyback. It's just got a little bit too much twist in the singles for my preferences, because when I go to ply and I add that little bit more twist, it's going to really come out like a wiry yarn. It's going to start to really look like and feel like rope. So what does an underspun plyback test look like? Well, if I start to barely treadle, my yarn immediately starts to thicken up. And when I go to do that plyback test, the yarn has an almost, it looks lighter, it looks loftier. The singles are still twist locked, but the plyback test looks underplied. It looks underspun. And there's areas of the yarn where you can't tell which fibers are a part of which singles. It almost looks a bit fuzzy. This to me is underspun singles. And then of course, like the other yarns, when we add that slight half twist for the plying, it's still underspun. It still doesn't really look like a viable yarn. And the reason why I don't like these really underspun yarns for Longwools personally is because the tips will eventually ease their way out of the yarn. Longwools are sort of known for having a bit of a halo. And in my experience, when the yarn is underspun, like if you leave Longwools as singles, for example, and you do really low twist singles with your Longwools, they're beautiful. They're just gorgeous yarns, and you can fold them slightly and they look great. But from my experience, they don't wear really super well. They tend to get quite fuzzy. The halo becomes even more pronounced. So in my experience with spinning these wools, there's sort of a happy medium. And that's a little bit more twist in the singles and a little bit more twist in the ply, but not so much that you're ending up with rope or that you're ending up with a really wiry yarn, because the Longwools don't bend super well. They're not like the fine wools where they bend in all different ways and they have that really cohesive look in the finished fabric. They tend to loop and coil, and so they make like bouclés really beautifully. They just do bouclé yarns so well, because that looping feature of those yarns brings out the attributes of the Longwools just beautifully. But if you make your singles quite wiry and then you ply and the yarn, the finished yarn is quite wiry, it brings out those attributes of Longwools that I think in some ways give Longwools a bit of a bad rap. And so if we can spin them a little bit more gently and add that air in there and don't completely compress all of that air out of there, we're going to end up with a really beautiful yarn. When I'm plying the Longwools, I do watch the angle of twist quite closely. I make sure that that angle of twist is not more than 40 or 45 degrees. And I seem to lean more towards a finished twist angle between 30 and 40 degrees. So I'm not plying these yarns really super hard. And they come out really beautifully. And do remember that some of that ply twist is going to get lost in the water. And because of that, you want to make sure that you're adding a tiny bit more twist in the plying, knowing that some of that's going to dissipate in the water. So I might go for a ply twist of sort of between 35 and 40 degrees, knowing that the finished yarn is going to end up around 35, 33 degrees in the end. So this yarn here is just exactly what I'm looking for in the plyback test. So I hope that that was helpful, and I hope that you feel like you can approach your Longwools with a little bit more success. As we approach different projects and different opportunities to spin, I really encourage you to do lots of sampling. Try lots of different approaches when it comes to spinning all of the different wool that you have access to. Blend it with other fibers. Try it with different things. Mix it with other wools. Don't be afraid to make a 15-gram nest of fiber and spin it and just see what happens. 15 grams spins up like nothing, and you'll learn so much in the process. So make a blend, play with your percentages, and see what you come up with. So I've had various projects over the years with the Longwools that have gone really super well. One of my absolute most favorite projects over the years was the Albini cardigan by Orlaine Souche. I'll talk about this in just a moment and I'll show you some photos. But this has become one of those sweaters that has a little bit of superstition around it now, because in every single School of Sweet Georgia workshop that I have filmed, I wear that sweater at some point in the filming of that particular course. So every single course on the School of Sweet Georgia has that sweater in there somewhere, and I'm wearing it at some point. So because that sweater was out of Disdarrow Ranch's Romney mohair, it was a blend that they have done locally here in British Columbia from their Romney and their mohair clip every year. I can spin more of that yarn. I can get more of that color of yarn. I'll show you photos in just a moment, like I said. But it has become a piece in my collection that I consider a bit of an heirloom. And so what does heirloom mean to each of us? And where does ascribing a garment or a piece that we've made get the status of heirloom? And that is one of those projects that I loved the spinning, I loved the knitting, and I loved wearing it. And it was just one of those sweaters that has just been, I knocked it out of the park. Not to toot puff too much, but that particular project, it was a mashup and a mixture of all these different elements that went really well. And when that happens, it just leaves your cup full. You feel like you just nailed it. So that sweater does not get worn as much as it did a couple of years ago. And a lot of that is just because, as hard wearing as it is, I want to have it for a really super long time. So I tend to default to wearing some of my other sweaters that haven't seen as hard wear as that one. And I hope that as a result, that particular sweater, my Albini, will last for many, many, many years. So let me show you some photos of the different projects that have been real successes over the years. And I'll share with you sort of some of the pros and cons and some of the things to think about when you're spinning your Longwools. So first off, let's have a look at the yarn that I was just spinning for you guys at the wheel. So this is the 30-gram skein that I gave back to my friend Melissa of Melly Knits. This was part of the Sommelier Guts 2 club from November of 2024, for those who are watching in the future. This was the Disdarrow Ranch mixed with 15 grams of llama. And Lori's Romney that comes from here in British Columbia from Disdarrow Ranch is really, really lovely. It's just a wonderful flock. The wool that they produce is really, really great. It is, I think it's a registered flock if my memory serves. The resulting yarn, just as I spoke about in the video with you guys just now, has a lovely finished twist. I did add a little bit more ply twist when I was plying this skein. It has since been washed and finished, so I soak it in quite warm water with a little bit of eucalyptus, and then I just snap it and hang it to dry. And as a result, the twist angle is sort of somewhere around 33 to 35 degrees. When I was plying, it was closer to 40 degrees. The result, however, will give me a medium yarn that will knit up beautifully into a medium fabric with a nice feel, but still drapey. It won't be too airy. It won't be structurally unsound where I can poke at it enough to poke my finger through it, because there's not enough structure to that yarn and therefore to the fabric. But I don't need to worry about wiry, ropey stitches and fibers that won't settle into those knit stitches really super nicely. So let me show you an example of where this wool mixed with mohair instead of llama worked really super well, and that was, like I was just mentioning, in my Albini sweater. So this sweater was Romney mohair, Romney sourced from the same farm, from Disdarrow Ranch. And as you can see in the fabric here, the knit stitches nestled, the fibers were able to nestle into those stitches really nicely. They were able to fill in the holes and the gaps in the fabric, and they were able to just settle in. And Elizabeth Zimmerman talks about this, that as we wear our woolen sweaters, And I don't mean woolen spun, I just mean like our wool as we wear it. Those stitches settle and they sort of, there starts to become an overall cohesion to the fabric. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. It's just this sweater has been worn, it's been washed, it's been laid flat to dry, it's been spun in the spin cycle in my dryer to get, or in my washing machine to get it clean after wearing it many, many times. And over time, those stitches have just settled into where they're supposed to sit, creating an overall really cohesive fabric and a hard wearing fabric. It does have a little bit of a halo, as you can see. And this yarn, it was a 2-ply. It did not like being ripped and re-knit. So there was a couple of sections, particularly on the collar, where I re-knit the ribbing at the top a couple of times. Orlean has some decreases that are done and some short rows and whatnot. And I think I had misread the pattern or something, and I had to rip back. And the 2-ply Romney mohair, it didn't like that. It brought out the halo even more. It didn't beat up the yarn to the point that it wasn't knittable. It just brought out that halo from that abrasion of ripping the yarn back. Something to think about, with the fine to medium wools, they don't tend to halo to the same extent that these long wools will. A nice substitute for some of the commercial yarns out there that are on the market that are really popular right now, the kid silk yarns and whatnot, is to blend in that mohair, that kid mohair. Blend that into your wools, and then rather than holding 2 yarns together, you will naturally have that halo of the mohair stick out. Not to the same extent as those brushed yarns for sure, but it will give you that halo that you're looking for and create that slight fuzz in the stitches that's really, really popular right now. So that was the Albini. One of the other projects that I had a lot of success with was this woven wrap. So this was back in 2018. I spun this yarn, I think in 2017, and this was a singles yarn that I did out of Wensleydale. Now, I talked very briefly in the video about spinning singles and the Longwools working really well for singles, but also not to spin them with too low twist. And one of the reasons for that is that the staple length is quite long, and those there needs to be enough twist that those fibers can grab onto each other and twist enough to make a structurally sound fabric. Otherwise, what's going to happen if those singles are too low twist, especially without ply twist added and another singles being put with it to add at least a little bit of strength, that singles yarn will just drift apart. So you'll go to skein it and go to wash and finish it, and your yarn is drifting apart as you're trying to work with it. So when I do my plyback tests for working with singles, I do tend to look for that little bit more structurally sound plyback test rather than just a really super airy, poofy plyback test that's not going to be structurally sound. Make sure that those fibers are twist locked. Then when you give them a tug test, when you're leaving them as singles, that they're going to stay together. And this stole worked out really super well. I did full the singles ever so slightly, and I did full the wrap ever so slightly. I followed Laura Fry's method of fulling that she talks about in her weaving process. Her videos are, I think those are older finishing videos for weaving, and they're available on Long Thread Media, I think. She also talks about fulling in her School of Sweet Georgia course as well. And yeah, both of these yarns were singles, warp and weft, but the Wensleydale was in the weft, and it did get a little bit of braided as I was working with it. So as it went through the shuttle and went through the fabric and was woven as the weft, with the heddle running along the warp, it did bring up the warp a little bit. It was a Polworth silk in the warp. It did bring out a little bit of an abrasion or a bit of halo in the warp, but that Wensleydale already having a halo post finishing had even a little bit more of a halo being nestled into the weft. I would expect that. It's a really lovely wrap regardless, and I really enjoy wearing it. And then finally, let's talk about a project that maybe didn't go quite to plan. And this was also Disdarrow Ranch Romney, but this was Romney that was a little bit coarser. It was a slightly higher micron count, a little bit denser. It had been put into or processed into quite a large bat that was more for industrial purposes. It probably would have done really well as batting in between quilt layers. And this was, and it was carded. It was a little bit tangled. There was quite a few places where there were tangles that I had to pull out as I was spinning with my nails. But you can really see with, as these photos are cycling through, you can see how the Romney fibers didn't settle into those knit stitches quite as nicely as the other Romney that was a lower micron, that was finer. Here is a great photo of the sleeve cuff that you can see along the ribbing there. It was a broken rib on the edge there. This fennel sweater pattern it was also by Orleans Souche, has some lovely finishing details in it, just like in her Albini pattern. And you can see in that ribbing how those Romney fibers were really resisting turning the corner of the ribbing itself. And it almost kind of distorts the knitted fabric. It doesn't, we're so used to seeing knitted fabric where the wool just settles into those stitches really beautifully because we're so used to working with fine to medium wools. We're used to working with that finer crimp, the really bouncy, springy wools that we all think of when we think of fabric and knitting. These long wools with their slightly denser fibers and their slightly higher micron count and their lower crimp, usually 3 to 6 crimp in a lock, they're going to resist turning and settling into those knit stitches like what we see in the fine to medium wools. So look for that because it's very interesting to see it in the knit fabric if you haven't seen that distortion before. Once you see it, you'll never unsee it. You'll see it in other fabrics that are done with the long wools. You probably won't see it with BFL because BFL is generally next to the skin. It's a finer micron. It tends to be able to turn the corner quite nicely, but you will see it in some of the slightly higher micron long wools. You see it here with this Romney that's a little bit coarser, a little bit denser. You're certainly going to see it in fibers like Cotswold, Wensleydale. This is also one of the reasons why people don't particularly like chain plying these long wools. It's because when you chain ply and you create that knot along the length of the yarn, you will see where that knot was created as that long wool literally turns the corner. This is why, like I mentioned when we were at the spinning wheel, this is why these wools do so incredibly well in yarn structures like boucle. And it's because of that looping crimp that just creates those beautiful spirals and those beautiful loops that just make those yarns sing. And so I would highly encourage you, if you've got some of these yarns in your stash and you've not ever made boucle, to go ahead and do just that. Make some boucle. So overall, this sweater worked really super well, but there were a few things that I probably would have done differently, like some different finishing techniques on the cuffs and at the bottom along the lower ribbing of the body of the cardigan that would have resulted in a slightly nicer finished fabric because of the attributes of this particular Romney and this particular type of wool. So I want to thank you for joining me today. I want to thank you for being here. Thank you to those who took the time out of their day to follow along on this Longwools journey that I've taken you on. I hope that you learned something, and I hope that some of the tips and tricks that I shared with you give you some encouragement at the wheel and help you to be successful with those advents that are coming out over the next month or so that will include probably a couple, if not a long wool. I hope that you can approach them with increased confidence and feel like you have some tools in your toolkit to be able to spin these wools and end up with yarns that you're really happy with, that have some bounce, have some sproing, but also have that beautiful drape that we look for in long wools. You know, we look for that yeah, that beautiful drape and that sheen that comes off of these fibers that just makes our hearts sing. So I hope that you feel successful. I hope that you've learned something. Comment below if there's something that you're still wondering about, if there's something else that you would like to learn about or would like to know about, would like some more ideas about. I love to hear from you guys, and I really appreciate your thoughts. I hope you have a wonderful season of making. I will catch you all next time. Have a wonderful time at the wheel or your spindle. Until then, happy spinning, guys. Bye.